I need you to stop whatever you're doing and watch this. Not because I want your attention. Because what is happening right now in the Strait of Hormuz will affect the price of everything you buy, every gallon of gas you pump, every product on every shelf at every store in America. Within days. Not months. Days. Here is where we are right now. The Strait of Hormuz, the narrow waterway between Iran and Oman through which roughly 20% of the world's entire oil supply flows every single day, has effectively stopped moving. Not slowed down, not reduced, stopped. 150 ships are sitting anchored in open water outside the strait because their captains and their insurance companies have made the same calculation. The risk of sailing through is too high to accept. The clock is ticking, and for some countries, that clock has fewer than 14 days left on it. Let me show you exactly what is happening, who is at risk, what happens next, and what it means for you specifically if you live in the United States. Before we talk about what is happening today, you need to understand why the Strait of Hormuz is the single most important piece of water on the planet for the global economy. The strait is just 21 miles wide at its narrowest point. That is smaller than the distance from downtown Chicago to O'Hare Airport. 2 shipping lanes, each just 2 miles wide, carry traffic in each direction. And through those 4 miles of open water flows 20 million barrels of oil every single day. That is approximately 20% of all the oil consumed globally. Saudi Arabia's oil, Iraq's oil, Kuwait's oil, Qatar's oil, the UAE's oil. All of it flows north through the Gulf and then squeezes through this bottleneck to reach the world. On top of the crude oil, approximately 20 to 22% of the world's entire liquefied natural gas supply, most of it from Qatar, the world's 3rd largest LNG exporter, also moves through the same corridor. According to the U.S. Energy Information Administration in 2024, 84% of all crude oil moving through the strait was headed to Asian markets: China, India, Japan, South Korea. Their factories, their transport networks, their power grids, all running on Gulf energy that has to pass through those 2-mile shipping lanes. Europe gets 12 to 14% of its LNG from Qatar through the same passage. Now here is the thing that every energy analyst has known for decades and every war planner has feared for just as long. There is no real alternative. Saudi Arabia has a pipeline, the East-West Pipeline, that can move up to 7 million barrels per day across the Arabian Peninsula to the Red Sea, bypassing Hormuz. The UAE has the Fujairah Pipeline, but both of those routes combined cannot replace the 20 million barrels per day that flow through the strait. The infrastructure simply does not exist at that scale. If Hormuz closes, even partially, the world cannot reroute. It absorbs the shortage, and it pays the price at every pump and every port on Earth. Here's what makes the current Hormuz crisis different from every previous threat Iran has ever made about closing the strait. Iran has threatened to close the Strait of Hormuz dozens of times over the past 2 decades. Every single time, analysts said it would be a strategically suicidal move, that closing the strait would choke off Iran's own oil exports and give the U.S. Navy justification to use overwhelming force to reopen it. Iran didn't use naval ships this time. Iran didn't use mines. Iran didn't need anti-ship missiles to shut down every vessel. Iran used cheap drones. As Kevin Book, co-founder of the research firm Clearview Energy Partners, told NPR, all Iran had to do was conduct several drone strikes in the vicinity of the Strait of Hormuz. And suddenly, insurers and shipping companies decided it was unsafe to traverse that very narrow waterway. That's it. That's the whole strategy. By March the 2nd, a senior IRGC official officially confirmed that the strait was closed and threatened to set ablaze any vessel that attempted to pass through. Tanker traffic dropped first by approximately 70%. Then it went to essentially zero. Over 150 ships anchored outside the strait. Maersk, CMA CGM, Hapag-Lloyd, the 3 largest container shipping companies on Earth, all suspended transits. Iraq, a major oil producer, began shutting down production at some of its largest oil fields. Why? Because without being able to export through Hormuz, they had nowhere to put the oil they were pumping. Qatar Energy halted activity at the world's largest LNG export facility after Iranian drone attacks targeted its facilities in Ras Laffan Industrial City and Mesaieed Industrial City. The world's gas supply, the world's oil supply, both disrupted simultaneously in 6 days. Let's talk about what this is already doing to prices, because the numbers are alarming and we are still in the early days of this disruption. When this conflict began on February 28th, Brent crude oil was trading at approximately $73 per barrel. By March 2nd, just 4 days later, it had surged to over $82 per barrel, a 13% jump in 4 days. Analysts at Goldman Sachs, RBC Capital Markets, and Kepler all said the same thing. If the disruption continues, $100 per barrel is not a ceiling. It is a milestone on the way to something higher. Halima Croft, global head of commodity strategy at RBC Capital Markets, said it directly. We're now facing what looks like the biggest energy crisis since the oil embargo in the 1970s. The 1973 oil embargo, the one that caused gasoline lines stretching around city blocks in America, the one that caused a global recession. That is the historical comparison energy experts are reaching for right now. LNG prices in Asia spiked 137% in just 5 days, from $10.70 per MMBTU on February 27th to $25.40 by March 3rd. European natural gas futures, the TTF benchmark, surged 85% in just 2 days, briefly breaking through 60 euros per megawatt hour. Financial markets are responding. Japan's Nikkei dropped over 2%. South Korea's Kospi suffered its biggest crash since the 2008 financial crisis, dropping up to 12% in a single day and triggering automatic circuit breakers. Pakistan's KSE 100 index recorded its largest ever single-day decline, losing nearly 10% of its value. And remember, the disruption has been going for 6 days as of Thursday. The price shock is not priced in yet. Not fully. The tankers sitting anchored in the Gulf right now, the oil that was already loaded and waiting to ship before the crisis began, will be the last buffer between stable markets and a full supply emergency. When those preloaded cargoes run out and nothing replaces them, the next leg of the price surge will begin. This is the section of this video that I need you to pay the most attention to, because the timeline is not theoretical. It is being stated by government officials and lawmakers in the countries most at risk, in public, on the record. South Korea is the clearest example of the countdown that is now running. A South Korean lawmaker publicly stated that the country has LNG reserves for approximately 9 days. The government's official position is more reassuring. They say actual stockpiles exceed the mandatory 9-day requirement, and they are seeking alternative supplies from Australia and Southeast Asia. South Korean President Lee Jae-myung announced a 100 trillion won, approximately $68 billion emergency stabilization fund to cope with the energy price surge. South Korea is a country that gets 70% of its crude oil from the Middle East and derives 30% of its electricity from LNG. Its factories are running, its hospitals are running, its heating systems are running. All of that depends on a supply chain that currently has a gap in it. Japan is in a more stable position. The government says it has approximately 254 days of strategic oil reserves, but Japanese refiners have already asked the government to release stockpiled oil. And critically, utility companies hold only about 3 weeks of LNG. Japan gets 70% of its Middle Eastern oil through the Strait. China holds strategic petroleum reserves large enough to cover approximately 200 days of oil imports, according to Societe Generale's head of global commodities. But China is also the world's largest oil importer. It cannot simply wait this out indefinitely. And analysts at K-Peeler note that China will increase purchases of Russian crude as an alternative, which has its own geopolitical consequences. India has strategic oil reserves covering approximately 74 days of supply, including oil stored in underground caverns and at refineries. India relies heavily on Gulf imports and is now monitoring the situation as supply shortfalls threaten to drive up domestic inflation. The Philippines says it has roughly 2 months of energy reserves. The key word in all of these statements is reserves. These countries are drawing down stockpiles. Every day that Hormuz stays effectively closed, those stockpiles shrink. And when they run out, or when they fall low enough that governments begin to panic about running out, the bidding war begins. What you would see is hoarding, said oil analyst Robert McNally of Rapidan Energy, speaking to CNBC. You would see the mother of all bidding wars. Now, the question that matters most to you if you are watching this from the United States: does America run out of oil? The short answer is no, not in the way South Korea or Japan might. But the longer answer is more complicated. The United States is no longer dependent on Middle Eastern oil. American domestic production from the shale revolution has insulated the U.S. from the direct supply shock that Asian importers are facing right now. The Strategic Petroleum Reserve currently holds approximately 415 million barrels. The Trump administration could tap those reserves if domestic prices spiral. But here is what domestic production and strategic reserves cannot protect you from. Oil is a global commodity. When Brent crude goes to $100 a barrel or higher, U.S. domestic oil prices rise with it, regardless of whether American oil comes from Texas or the Persian Gulf. The global price of oil is the price you pay at the pump, full stop. And it is not just gasoline. Everything that gets manufactured, packaged, or shipped uses energy. When oil prices spike, the cost of producing food goes up. The cost of shipping electronics goes up. The cost of making plastics, fertilizers, pharmaceuticals, every product that relies on petrochemical inputs goes up. Kevin Book from Clearview Energy Partners put it this way: in supply crises, duration matters, scale too. A full Hormuz crisis could outstrip offsets provided by strategic stocks. The longer Hormuz stays closed, the more American consumers feel it. Not through empty gas stations, but through a slow, grinding inflation surge that touches every corner of the economy. The logical question at this point is, can the U.S. military simply force the strait back open? In theory, yes. The U.S. Navy has the most powerful surface fleet on Earth. Multiple carrier strike groups are currently operating in the region. The Fifth Fleet is headquartered in Bahrain, right next to the strait. In practice, it is more complicated. The Strait of Hormuz is only 2 miles wide in each direction. It is bordered on one side by Iran, a country with thousands of shore-based anti-ship missiles, fast attack boats, drone boats, naval mines, and suicide drones. Iran has spent 40 years preparing specifically for a scenario in which the U.S. Navy tries to force the strait open. Moreover, and this is the critical point, the U.S. military is already fighting Iran on 11 different fronts simultaneously. It is conducting strikes inside Iranian territory. It has sunk an Iranian warship in the Indian Ocean. It is defending bases in Kuwait, Bahrain, Jordan, and Saudi Arabia from drone and missile attacks. It is managing a NATO alliance crisis over the Turkish airspace incident. Reopening the Strait of Hormuz by force would require a separate, sustained military campaign against Iran's shore-based defenses, while simultaneously continuing every other active operation in the war. That is a significant ask of a military that is already stretched across one of the most complex operational environments in modern history. What it means practically, the strait will reopen when this war ends politically, or when Iran's military capability is degraded enough that it can no longer credibly threaten shipping. Neither of those outcomes has a clear timeline. I don't make videos to scare you. I make videos to give you information that lets you make better decisions. So here is what the data suggests for the next few weeks. On gasoline, prices at the pump have already begun moving. If the disruption continues for 3 to 4 more weeks, analysts project Brent crude could reach or exceed $100 per barrel. That translates to pump prices potentially rising by 40 to 60 cents per gallon in the near term. If you are planning on driving trips or have flexibility on timing, now is a better time to fill your tank than in 3 weeks. On groceries and goods, energy is an input cost for virtually everything. A sustained oil price shock will show up in grocery prices, shipping costs, and manufactured goods within weeks to months. This is not the moment to panic, but it is the moment to reduce unnecessary discretionary spending and build a modest household reserve of staples if you haven't already. On investments, energy stocks historically outperform during supply shocks. U.S. domestic oil producers, insulated from the supply disruption but benefiting from the price surge, are seeing increased analyst attention. On the other side, airlines, shipping companies, and manufacturing sectors face significant cost pressure. This is not investment advice, but these are the dynamics to understand as you evaluate your own financial exposure. On the bigger picture, this crisis will resolve. The 1973 oil embargo ended. The 1990 Gulf War oil shock ended. Every previous Hormuz crisis ended. This one will too. The question is how long it lasts, and whether the political and military decisions being made in Washington, Tehran, and Brussels shorten that timeline or extend it. The Strait of Hormuz, through which 20% of the world's daily oil supply flows, has been effectively closed for 6 days, not by a naval blockade, but by cheap Iranian drones, and the rational decision of insurers and shipping companies that the risk is too high to accept. Countries across Asia are drawing down strategic reserves. South Korea's mandatory minimum is 9 days. Japan's LNG supply covers about 3 weeks. Asian LNG spot prices have risen 137% in 5 days. European natural gas futures are up 85%. Oil analysts are comparing this to the 1973 oil embargo, the last time a supply disruption of this scale hit global energy markets simultaneously. The U.S. Strategic Petroleum Reserve holds 415 million barrels, but oil is a global commodity, and American consumers will feel the price shock regardless of domestic production levels. The clock is running on every country's strategic reserve. The question is not whether this matters. The question is how long it lasts. If you want to stay ahead of this story, not the headlines, but the actual strategic picture beneath them, hit subscribe. I'll be here every day this war is active with the information that actually matters. And share this video. Because the people in your life who don't know what is happening in the Strait of Hormuz right now are about to find out at the gas pump, and they deserve to understand why. I'll see you in the next one.